Universal Proxy, the latest. I'm here today with Sheldon Nagesh, who's going to talk to us about Universal Proxy. Universal Proxy? Universal Proxy. Sheldon is at Gibson Dunn in the Washington, D.C. office. He formerly was in-house as an associate general counsel at Freddie Mac. Today on realtransparentdisclosure.com. I'm Brock Romanek, and I'm a big fan of yous. So Sheldon, we're going to talk about universal proxy. This is a topic you've been following more closely than me this proxy season. This is the first proxy season that we've had universal proxy on the books. So the first question, obvious question for you is, how did universal proxy fare this season?
Yeah, Brock, thanks. So the reason we're having this discussion today, and I think one of the biggest corporate governance trends over the last year, is a large number of public companies amending their bylaws in response to the universal proxy rules. We've seen approximately 40% of the S&P 500, for example, amend their bylaws in light of universal proxy. I think in part, which we'll get into later, is on the theory that universal proxy will increase the number of proxy contests. So I think it's important to note with where we are today that we're still in year one, and we've dealt with a relatively small sample size of proxy contest. And I think that activists and companies are very much still feeling the situation out. Having said that, we've seen a moderate decrease in the number of proxy contests with voting outcomes, but we've seen a moderate increase in the number of settlements. With respect to the limited number of proxy contests that have gone to a voting outcome, we have seen activists winning board seats. And while they may not be winning all of the board seats they sought, they are getting some seats. So while historically we've generally seen clean sweeps or not, the contest this year that did make it to a vote have seen shareholders split their votes between incumbents and challengers, which I think is what the universal proxy rules aim to facilitate. With regard to the number of settlements we've seen between activists and companies, I think, if you're a company and you're confronted with an activist that's a known activist, that's well-funded, with a viable campaign topic, I think we will continue to see more companies settle, presumably because if there's a real chance that the company will lose a seat, which some believe the universal proxy rules increase the likelihood of, or certainly at least increase the uncertainty of, companies may decide that settling is the preferable path. So I think we're still in the early days, and I think we'll talk about where this is maybe going next year. But I think right now we are seeing some effects from the universal proxy rules, though it may not be as big as everyone initially maybe thought.
Right. So you talked about this being a small sample size, and this is year one. Do you think year one portends more the same for next year, or this could be an aberration?
Yeah, I think with next season, some of the things I'm thinking about are what changes did the universal proxy rules make? So I know most of the viewers here are probably familiar with the rules, but as quick background, the universal proxy rules provide shareholders with the ability to pick and choose candidates from separate slates in a proxy contest. And shareholder voting at a shareholder meeting is different than I think most people think about a typical ballot in an election. I think the most popular ballot that we all think about is, politics and, a presidential candidate. And in that scenario, we have a universal proxy. All candidates are listed on the ballot. If I wanted to vote for a Republican candidate for president and a Democratic member of the House or Senate, I could do that, meaning I could split my votes between competing slates in that context. So here, shareholders now with universal proxy rules have the ability to mix and match among candidates using either side's card. And I think that this unconstrained ability to pick and choose among candidates really is going to play a central role in the discussion of how universal proxy may impact next season's proxy contest. And so I think to summarize my views, I think proxy contests may become more of a head-to-head contest of nominees as opposed to a context of ideas. So I think next season, what we might see is first, I think dissidents are now able to more effectively target individual directors. For example, if you look at the 2023 proxy contest with Disney, the activists in Disney nominated a single candidate and positioned that candidate to run against a specific Disney incumbent director. And the activists in Disney made the contest personal and encouraged shareholders to compare its challenger directly to the Disney incumbent. So I think the Disney proxy contest highlights that activists will have significantly more incentive to spotlight which incumbent nominees should be replaced. I think the result we're going to see from that is an increase in direct public tax on individual directors. I think second, and I think this was, concern at the onset of the universal proxy rules was the potential creation of single issue directors. The notion of changing a single director will be easier to sell to other shareholders, given that the relative influence of the board would remain intact. And the universal proxy rules allow company shareholders to split their votes between the incumbents and the challengers more easily than they could before. And so I think you might see single issue director candidates running at, let's say, an ESG campaign, or maybe we could even see a labor union or something like that. I think the third point I would make for next season is I think we're going to see an increasing impact to the proxy advisory firms. In situations where ISS and Glass Lewis endorse one or two distant candidates, it's going to be easier for shareholders to follow their advice, given the ability to now mix and match that we talked about before. And this ability to mix and match and follow ISS's advice is going to be more practical now in a way that it wasn't before. Before universal proxy, if a shareholder wanted to follow ISS's advice or Glass Lewis completely by splitting its votes between competing slates, it would have to either go to the trouble of obtaining a legal proxy, which involves expense and just a headache, or travel in person to the annual shareholder meeting. Or if it wanted to vote by proxy, it would have to vote for only some of the company's nominees or some of the activist nominees. But in either case, it wouldn't vote completely. So I think in situations where ISS or Glass Lewis endorse one but not all of an activist candidates, their influence is going to increase a little.
Great analysis. All right, so you talked about a lot of companies making changes to their advance notice bylaws. Do those changes mean anything really?
I think with all things in life, it depends on who you ask. But I think, like, stepping back for 1 second. So I mentioned earlier that 40% of the S&P 500 has amended their bylaws in light of universal proxy. Why are they doing this? Well, they're amending their bylaws, and they're specifically amending the advance notice provisions of the bylaws. So what are advance notice provisions? Advance notice bylaws are just requirements that shareholders must satisfy in order to nominate a director at a shareholder meeting. They generally contain procedural requirements, such as requiring a shareholder to notify the company a reasonable time in advance of the annual meeting that they want to nominate a director. And they also require a shareholder to provide the company with information about the shareholder and about the shareholder nominee. Now, these requirements are in place to allow the board to have enough time and enough information to evaluate the candidate and to make all available information available to shareholders. Without this, the company would have minimal information and not really enough time to make a proper evaluation of the candidate. So that's the purpose of advance notice bylaws. And importantly, and I think this is central to answer your question, is that advance notice provisions are not designed to eliminate the possibility of an activist nominating directors. And so do all these advance notice changes really mean anything? I think the answer is yes, but I think that to the extent someone is putting these in place, thinking that they're going to completely eliminate the possibility of an activist, that's not the purpose of advance notice bylaws. So, of course, most of the issue that's caused the most controversy are the changes that companies have made to require more information from shareholders nominating candidates. There's been a lot of discussion regarding potential company overreach regarding advance notice changes, including a controversial case where many commenters viewed that company as taking an extremist approach to the type of information it requested. And this became an issue for certain shareholders this season. During the 2023 proxy season, for example, we saw at least 30 shareholder proposals that were filed requesting that companies agree not to adopt universal proxy bylaw amendments without shareholder approval. But to bring this back, I do believe the advance notice changes did accomplish meaningful objectives. You have to remember that amending a company's bylaws is generally an infrequent occurrence, and many companies that decided to update the advance notice provisions of their bylaws simply brought these bylaw provisions in line with current market practice. Some companies haven't touched their advance notice bylaws since their IPO, for example. And so I think bringing their advance notice bylaws and the information that they request in line with current market practice and the types of information the board and the company and shareholders need to really evaluate a nominee was the meaningful objective of a lot of these changes.
So I feel like I've spent half my long career watching a huge battle over proxy access, and now I wonder even whether proxy access is dead.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it's difficult to envision a scenario where a shareholder would choose to use proxy access over universal proxy, and I think there's a few reasons for this. And stepping back, proxy access just allows a shareholder to access the company's proxy statement and proxy card and relies exclusively on the company's own proxy card and proxy statement to distribute information about the activist director. Whereas in contrast, universal proxy requires the company and the dissent to each file and distribute their own proxy statements and proxy cards. So as we discussed earlier, before universal proxy, activists choosing to run a short slate, meaning that they were nominating less candidates than were actually up for the board, were at a perceived disadvantage as a result of the two competing proxy cards. So one benefit that proxy access provided was solving for this disadvantage, since all the candidates, the dissent's candidates and the company's candidates, were on the company's proxy card. But with the universal proxy rules, activists are no longer at that disadvantage if they run a short slate, because both sides' candidates, as we mentioned earlier, will be listed on both sides' card. Another benefit that proxy access was that it reduced the cost and procedural difficulties of running a contest, since shareholders didn't have to prepare, file, or activists didn't have to prepare, file, and mail their own separate proxy statements. However, it's hard to see the cost difference or any potential cost savings between using universal proxy and proxy access as being the determining factor in a shareholder's decision to unseat an incumbent director. Lastly, and we won't get into all the history behind it, but unlike universal proxy, which is an SEC rule, proxy access is just a contractual right under the bylaws. And because proxy access is a contractual right, many proxy access bylaws impose eligibility requirements that universal proxy doesn't have. So you might see a proxy access bylaw that has a minimum ownership threshold of 3%. And now that can be aggregated with up to 20 shareholders, for example, but there's still an ownership requirement there that universal proxy doesn't have. Most proxy access bylaws also have a requirement that shareholders own stock for 2 to 3 years before being able to even use proxy access. That doesn't exist with universal proxy. And then proxy access bylaws also, most of them have a limit on the number of candidates that a shareholder can nominate, up to 2, for example. So given that the universal proxy provides essentially a lot of the benefits that proxy access does with less hurdles that I just went through, it's difficult to envision a scenario where a shareholder would choose to use proxy access over universal proxy. Having said all of that, even this past season, we were still seeing companies receive shareholder proposals requesting that they implement proxy access. And so I think what it really is going to move to is proxy access is now going to be a symbol or a marker of good corporate governance, as opposed to a tool that a dissenter or an activist would actually.
You deprive an old man of hearing a history lesson, you know that us old people love nothing better than to talk about the good old days. Thanks so much, Sheldon, for your time and expertise. That was awesome. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Brock.